you take a basketball player and you have them do nothing but shoot free throws or whatever. Like, you're just going to be really, really, really good at that. If they did that for a whole year and then you threw them on the court, they would be a terrible basketball player, right? Their coordination would be off, their dribbling, their passing, like the reaction time. Sure, they might be really good at shooting free throws, but they might not score a single point during the game because they never even get to the point where they get to use or express that skill. And so the same thing happens on a physiological perspective. Like, if you don't bring up your energy systems, guess what fuels protein synthesis? Guess what, is the thing that drives your recovery to allow you to switch back into parasympathetic mode? The ability to efficiently, mobilize, use, and distribute energy. Like, so if you don't ever do those things, well, guess what? It doesn't matter how many times you go in and improve your 1RM or try to, right? Your fitness is still terrible, and it's going to catch up with you.
Welcome to the Upside Strength Podcast, your number one fitness and performance resource in Switzerland. Today, I'm happy to welcome Kassem Hanson, creator of N1, through which he helps educate coaches in individualized biomechanics, program design, and nutrition. Kassem, thanks for coming on the podcast, man.
Hey, Sean. Good to be on.
Yeah, so for the audience, for those who don't know you yet, can you talk a little bit about you and who you are and what you do?
So, as you said, I'm an educator, and kind of I started my path, as most people do, and the interest in athletics and personal interest, and then went to school for biochemistry, pre-med, and shortly after that got really interested in some of the people in the private sector like Charles Poliquin and some functional medicine stuff, and just have never stopped wanting to continue to kind of pursue that education path, which led me to the basically conclusion that the only way to do things right is to do things on a very individual basis. And that's kind of the theme of what we do now, as we look at every aspect of training and nutrition and figure out how can we make this fit an individual rather than, a group or a population.
So you have a background in biochemistry and molecular biology, is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
And so
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I mean, it was kind of a pre-med, but that was the main focus. But I threw in like exercise science and kines and whatnot. Basically, I made sure that I didn't have any free time at university. That was kind of the goal.
Yes, you can definitely stay out of trouble through that timetable. So what I wanted to know is, you had the training in there, but from those maybe more theoretical fields, let's say, or maybe fields that are farther removed from the gym where you evolve primarily now, is there still something that you were able to take from those disciplines into what you do today as a coach, as an educator and a researcher?
Yes, but it didn't happen right away. Like, I actually started training people as just kind of, just a financial means, after I was taking a break from university, and I was like, well, this is the thing I can do that'll make some money and whatnot. And it wasn't until I really started taking it to an advanced level that kind of some of that, more technical education came into play, especially, from the biochem side. That's for like understanding kind of like, okay, maybe how could we drive a particular exercise stimulus, and how maybe is this nutrition or supplementation interacting. Some of that biochemistry really started to click when I started thinking a lot deeper in what I'm doing. But it wasn't like, okay, we're going in, we're doing 3 sets of 12 on squats or whatever, and I'm talking to my clients about the Krebs cycle. Like, if you want that stuff to be valuable, you have to be willing to put in the work to get to the point that you can use it.
Now that makes sense. Can you talk about, in your career so far, what have been some of the biggest mistakes you've made in the early days in your coaching?
Probably the same ones that most people made coming up through the same eras, right? I went through the period where, carbs were, awful, and, was throwing people on crazy training and stuff like that. So, I mean, I'm not immune from making a lot of the fad mistakes that the industry has gone throughout the years. But I would say uniquely to me, probably, going too deep down one path. And this is kind of something that I've tried to put on or pass on to our students, is that, being a specialist and really focus on one thing is good, but eventually you get to the point where it's actually that foundational information needs to be brought up with that, or that becomes the weakness. And so because I really like to dive deep into things, I would go into like, so for instance, when I went down functional medicine, I went too far down that rabbit hole and I would kind of lose the context of some of the other things. And then it's like, okay, now I'm focusing too much on the new nuances. I'm majoring in the minors. And so being able to like be able to step back and see that context and make sure like, okay, I'm not forgetting the obvious stuff because I'm so hyper focused on this specialty or this thing that really interests me right now.
Yeah. So kind of don't miss the forest for the trees. In functional medicine, what are some of the things that kind of pulled you deep and that made it hard for you to come back out and look at the big picture?
Well, I think it was when I really started getting into the testing, like, doing the organic acids tests and the blood tests and stuff like that. And when you get a report back and it's got data on it, your instinct is that you want to go and you want to correct all of those points. And I think that was probably the hardest thing to like say like, wait, maybe there's a simple thing that we can do that's going to affect all of this, on a grand scale. It's not a pill for an ill type thing, and that transfers over from like Western medicine into functional medicine. It's like, well, maybe this one group's using quote unquote supplements, the other one's using drugs or whatever, and it's like if you still look at it, it's like, okay, I'm trying to correct these things in the lab and I'm looking at each one of them instead of really seeing the context of a whole, and then also considering the individual of like, okay, I mean, do I really want to throw like, 7 supplements at this person? Or is there probably a conversation on lifestyle or something like that that's actually going to be, a more sustainable, bigger impact on these markers, but you don't see that in the book, right?
It's funny what you just said reminds me of something I learned through the Altus short sprints course. And Dan Pfaff talks about when you look at someone sprinting, finding the one poison that actually affects the movement instead of saying, oh, his knee's not going high enough, so he needs hip flexor, strength, or his whatever needs more hamstring flexibility. Actually look at the whole thing and determine what one thing might affect the whole instead of kind of picking every detail apart and then trying to, like you said, solve every little problem one after the other.
Exactly.
So you talked about Charles Poliquin. Who have been your biggest influences alongside Charles in your career as a coach?
I mean, so many, and the one thing I say is that the majority of people that have had a big influence me have influenced my direction or my thought process. So after Charles, like Bob Rakowski was one of the ones that really kind of turned me on to the functional medicine path. Even Paul Chek back on the day, like, he had this presentation on soil, and that's kind of what got me into like focusing on food quality and whatnot. And so it seems like at different points of my career, there's been different influences. And I think that the one thing that they all have in common is that they were all like very driven, like very education focused individuals that like continued on, like, like all of those guys are still on a path like of knowledge for themselves. Well, not Charles, rest in peace, but till his end, like Charles was still investigating, even despite all of their faults. I think that's the big thing that I picked up is that you're never done. Like all of them would open a presentation of with half of what I'm going to teach you right now is probably going to be wrong, in 10 years. And I think that's the one thing that I consistently picked up from all of those mentors is that you got to go with the best that you have right now, but never stop, because you're going to find we're going to know something better. A new study is going to come out. You're going to have some new observations, some anecdotes. Something's going to happen, and you're going to change. You're going to adapt. Don't ever get complacent.
So in that context, what are some of the beliefs that you maybe had coming into the field and that you've changed along the way that that have influenced by the things that you learned by not stopping and continuing to educate yourself?
Mm-hmm. So there have been a lot of places that it would have been kind of easy to stop. Charles had a bunch of program design stuff. It was very athletic based, and then after that, I went and I took some stuff that was very physics based. And I'm like, okay, there's a lot more to this exercise selection that we could do that they aren't necessarily looking at in the athletic realm, where all of these movements are dynamic and whatnot. And that's where I was like, okay, now half of that stuff doesn't matter because of strength profiles and momentum and all that stuff. And then in there, I was scratching in my head and I was thinking, well, this stuff's really cool and we could just go with this. But then I was like, but what about all of the internal mechanics of the muscle tissue, the architecture, the amount of pressure that's being built up? How is that affecting the equation? Because this might all just be like, malarkey, because it depends on that. And then that was the next pursuit that I took down. So it's kind of like I found something that would work a little bit better and then I debunk it. So it was kind of, going from finding a strength training model and then figuring out, well, there's a lot more that we can do from a biomechanics and a physics standpoint to make these exercises like maybe more physique based or better for a transformation client or an injury. And then I'm like, wait. Now I'm circling back into the biochemistry realm where I left school and finding out that actually that is the interplay in terms of like, well, the physics doesn't matter if we can't put the biochemical energy, if we don't have the hemodynamics to support the tension in the muscle, then the joint mechanics are irrelevant at that point. And it's just kind of been the cycle of like finding another level to add back into the system.
Yeah. So talking about N1, the company you created, and where you focus on that individualized approach, whether it's biomechanics, nutrition, or else. So what kind of pushed you down this path to starting this this endeavor? What flags did you see along the way that pushed you in that direction?
So for about, I think it was 3.5 years, I ran an online coaching program that was 6 months long and would get like 20 to 30 people in. And the guy that I was doing the program under, in terms of like the business, he had this demand where it's like, okay, everybody's program needs to be individualized but also the same, and that never quite made sense to me. But I did my darndest to try and make it happen, meaning that what I ended up doing is I would put people through like the same style of mesocycles, but like the volumes and the nutrition and stuff would have been tailored to them individually. And throughout that process, what we tended to see is trends. And actually, this is, to rewind back to a couple of the other questions. Like one of the things that I picked up from like Charles and Bob, especially, was just tracking tons of data, right? But also not getting lost in it. So I was tracking sleep and digestion and, how good are your pumps and soreness and diastics and morning heart rates and temperatures, like all sorts of stuff, right? From both the, the functional training world to the, or not functional, but functional medicine world and the strength training world, tracking all of these metrics, training and outside of training. And so we started to see patterns of how people were responding differently in terms of biometrics as well as results during these different phases of training, and how depending on what somebody would have in terms of like their pre-existing stress or inflammation or whatnot, they may or may not respond to a certain type of training. And it was actually dissecting that data after about the second year. So basically spent 4 rounds or 2 years just kind of going through that. And then all of a sudden those patterns emerged. And so then I had another like 1.5 years where it's like, okay, now let's actually challenge these patterns and see how they play out. And that's what kind of got me on like, man, it's not about like developing this perfect 6-month program. It's actually about putting this person on the right thing on the right time, and continually doing that over 6 months is going to be much better. Like no matter what I designed, like, because we refined that program, a little bit over and over and over based off of what we saw, but we still saw the same kind of limitations and be like, well, okay, if somebody is coming in and their sleep is crap when they do this style of training, they just get worse. Like it just makes their sleep worse. And then this other type of thing that they would do, be like, okay, like they would do just fine. I'm like, okay, so what that probably means is that if I have this person, there's the best program for them is the thing that their physiology can tolerate and have a positive adaptation to, not what the best program would look like on paper. I can't design a good program. This doesn't matter, no matter what my skill set is. I can't design a good program without the context of the individual.
And so what were the most important data points that you saw that correlated to some, how to say that, responses or non-responses maybe, or negative responses in the training realm from you talked about, heart rate in the morning, you talked about temperature, all those things. So what were the main ones that you saw kind of pop out when you analyzed all that data?
Mhm. Um, I mean, I think sleep was probably the biggest one for us, looking at that. And so one of the things that we tended to correlate with is that people that would like have trouble staying asleep throughout the night tended not to respond very well to the more metabolically demanding programs. So things that would kind of challenge the metabolic system more than, say, like a traditional strength training system where you're doing lower reps and longer rest periods. So when you would put them on that style, that very kind of lactic type training, their sleep patterns would get worse. And some people would go from decent sleep to poor sleep, but the trend always seemed to be that, like, okay, this would challenge people's ability to continually stay asleep at night. And then the thing we were to layer on top of that is it also seemed to be dependent on how many carbohydrates that person was able to tolerate and be able to take in. So if you took a person and they were, they were on a deficit and it was lower carbohydrate, their tolerance to that training before it would either disrupt their sleep or make it even worse was lower. But you could potentially mitigate some of those people that, weren't coming in really bad by either timing or dosing of carbohydrates to improve their tolerance to that. And so that was one of the big ones that was just pretty. They probably had the highest consistency, across the board on things. Other ones were people that tended to have higher inflammatory markers would not do well with things like supersets or trisets,
Hmm.
really long time under tension scales, which would be
Hmm.
more not necessarily systemically taxing depending on the exercise. Like if it's bicep curls, like you're pretty out of shape if you're systemically taxing yourself with bicep curls. Obviously, if it's squats or something like that, yeah, high rep squats are total body taxing. But the people that had the higher inflammatory markers, they didn't respond well to things that extended that local metabolic stress very much, right? They would tend to hold more water, they would be sore longer, and their performance just would not improve. And there would tend to be a cascade of like dominoes in terms of their, we'll say, like recovery markers, sleep, digestion, etc., morning energy that would start to fall apart on those type of training systems.
So is that something that you use now in your coaching and in your education in terms of, depending on maybe if somebody's going through a rough patch with sleep or with stress or with work,
Mhm.
you might actually change up their program to match that profile or to allow for their system to actually, improve and adapt and not get worse?
Yeah, so what we teach on the programming design side is we kind of have broken up like training into stimuli. And so we kind of have segregations of stimuli. Like we'll have like, okay, this is a more locally metabolic stimuli. Maybe we're focusing on some of those AMPK or mitochondrial adaptations. And then we might have this other thing like, well, this is systemically challenging. So it's going to have like upper or lower body supersets. And then we might have like a mechanical tension based thing where we're kind of focusing on volume of effective reps for hypertrophy. So it's about going back into those sets fully recovered but working within that window and certain degrees of failure, et cetera. So building these stimuli around the theoretical mechanisms of what would be going on, and then trying to match that with what we assess a client would then be able to do and get positive adaptation. So basically not compounding a exercise stimulus that is stressing out a system that already would appear stressed on their assessment. And so we kind of refer to that concept as like trainability, right? So it's like, okay, the best thing for you is something that your body can positively adapt to, not something that like it already is, that the system's already stressed or it's been stressed so long that your body's it's not going to make any positive adaptation to it. It's going to maintain homeostasis at best. And so that's kind of the base foundation of the way we do program design now is that we look at, okay, with an individual, what options do I have in terms of the stresses that I can put on their body? Which one of those is going to best work towards the goal that I'm trying to do? Because a lot of times you have options. Sometimes you don't have very many, but sometimes you have a lot of options. And then it's like, okay, now if we look at the macro cycle and the things that we want to cover, like what's going to be the best? And sometimes it may not be the thing that's most associated with their goal, a lot of times what we'll do is we're like, okay, we're going to do a phase of training right now that's going to bring up some either performance or recovery adaptations in you. So it's like we're kind of paying in, investing early so that we can have better quality training in the second and third months or whatever down the program.
In your experience, what are the least taxing types of training or training methods that you might use? Say someone maybe just had a child, so sleep is going to be out the window, and maybe stress is high at work. What is kind of the minimum maintenance kind of type training that you'll give to someone, so that again it allows them to not be completely broken all the time, but also still keep a minimum of something in the game while this hard phase goes through?
Just so there's one of those that exists on both extremes. So one of them would be on more of the strength side of things, where it's like, okay, you're doing lower volume per session but higher frequency, like strength type reps. So I mean, what we tended to call this is like, all right, it's we'll almost say like, well, it's kind of like metabolic loading with neurological or strength-based rep and rest intervals, and then you're using frequency as the driver. That's kind of what we do for deloads or people that are coming back in where they don't need a lot of stimulus per session at that point, right? Or they can't handle a lot of stress. So it's more about getting volume of tissue done, but creating a high amount of tension, and then just repeating that, in a frequent fashion. On the opposite side of things is what we call we call it either like an AMPK. That's like the goal that we're going for, or the mechanism that we're trying to trigger. But it's the most common method that we use of going after that is an incomplete rest method, where you're using a submaximal load, but what you're doing is you're doing repeated efforts with very short rest. So you're getting to the fatigue, the effective reps, and the metabolic stimulus via density rather than intensity. And that tends to be, from what we're able to observe, it tends to be less inflammatory, and it tends to, one of my theories is that it's less oxidatively stressful as well. When you get down to the biochemistry and you look at the situation of when we would throw kind of like the most, electrons out of that electron transport chain, I look at it almost like a red line in a car. So it's like a rev approach, where it's like we'd be pressing down on the gas pedal, letting off, pressing down, letting off, pressing down, letting off, versus pressing down and holding it, which is what I see like a very long set taken to failure. And it's like, okay, how can I challenge this metabolic system? Well, if anybody that's driven a car, especially one with the big engines, knows if you sit here and you just like rev the engine, you burn up gas really, really fast. And that's the whole goal of that training system, right? But if you just floor it and leave it there, you'll blow your engine. So it's trying to find that how do we stimulate some of these adaptations that are going to help us with, improving mitochondrial efficiency, improving nutrient transport into the cell, but without creating so much oxidative stress that we're going to get a lot of inflammation, and it's going to be an electrolyte imbalance and an immune stress on top of that.
Would that maybe in other terms, would you qualify that as almost like a cardiac output circuit, where you take, shorter sets, you far from failure, but with, like you said, incomplete rest from one to the next, and you kind of mix it up and keep it going for quite a while?
Yeah, well, I mean, the cardiac demand is probably going to depend really on just what muscle group you happen to be trained. So like going back to that, so like you could do this like Vince Gironda used a method that fits in this stimulus. It was his 8x8 method. You'd take like a 15 RM weight, you'd do 8 reps, rest 30 seconds, do 8 again. That's essentially an incomplete rest method. So if you're doing that for legs, it's going to be cardiovascularly demanding. If you're doing it for, middle delts, it's probably not going to be, very cardiovascular. So how much cardiovascular demand depends on, the size of the tissue and the complexity of the movement that you happen to be using. It's essentially like it's like HIIT with weights, basically, is kind of what it is, right?
Yeah.
But whether or not that's a systemic demand depends on what you're doing the HIIT with.
Yeah, I was what I had in mind was kind of a whole body routine, where you might not be focusing on one movement or body part, but you'll actually be hitting a little bit of everything, with, I guess, the goal in mind would be more that cardiac development, keeping that, that is a certain range with your heart rate without necessarily having specific local goals, let's say.
Yeah, so that's what we would call a systemic program.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So where the goal is not to tax any of the local tissues that much, but it would be to tax the system globally. In terms of the context of like what are the least stressful things, systemic training actually tends to be one of the hardest ones for people to manage if they're especially if they're able to push it.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a beginner, oftentimes you can put them on those programs, and because their local output is so poor, like they tolerate it fairly well. But what you'll notice is that actually the stronger and the more well-trained people tolerate those programs actually much less.
Okay.
So for instance, like back in the war days of taking courses, Charles had this hypertrophy camp, and one of the things you was death circuits. And so it was essentially squat, bench, trap bar, deadlift, pull up, like just cycled through, right? Which is brutal. And you'd look and like some of the smaller people, especially some of the females, they would just be going through those programs like, oh yeah, this is great, right? But you got one dude that like, benches twice his body weight, squats, like he goes through that circuit one time and he's dead, he's puking in the trash, like and you see this progression if you work with people over years too. It's like, okay, like now this needs to be modified. The rest intervals are different. The reps are going to be a little bit lower. Maybe instead of like 4 big movements, it's going to be like squat and then like bicep curls and then another big movement, like something like that, because you're just able to create so much more demand systemically, cardiopulmonary, metabolite clearance, etc., when you have more muscle and you produce more output. So it really kind of depends on the context of whether or not that would be a higher low stress program for people. And we, to be honest, at this point, our clientele is largely other coaches or like physique athletes and stuff like that. But it wasn't always the way. I used to work with the most broken of the broken all the way up to people getting on stage and everything in between. And you would see that pattern going across. And I would say the same thing, people that have sleep issues or inflammatory issues, that systemic taxation, you'd have to really watch the intensity at which you do it with them, or it would actually start negatively impacting the recovery.
No, that makes sense. So talking now about the physique world that you evolve in, what are some of the popular oversimplifications that still kind of are prevalent in that world that you see?
Oh geez, that's a big can of worms, right? I think if we continue on with the training aspect, I think a lot of what you see is that people have an off season and then they have a prep, and that prep is just all like cutting or whatever, and they're looking at it kind of like it's these two things, when in reality they would probably be better off managing certain adaptations in their body like year round, right? So like there's nothing wrong with staying in condition in the off season, like keeping your cardiovascular system healthy, keeping your like doing some things for mitochondrial nutrient partitioning, and occasionally dipping into those things that people tend to like when they see one of those programs, like, oh, this is a fat loss program, just because you're going to be breathing harder and it's going to burn more, that type of thing. Instead of like, oh yeah, no, like it's just like train heavy and eat a lot. It's, if you do that for a long enough time, you do yourself a disservice, because both on a cellular and a systemic level, you just become so deconditioned that then you're not that good at utilizing fat and partitioning, nutrients, and your recovery, your ANS and stuff. All of those things could be in a much better place starting prep, right? And then the same thing through prep, right? Like I think a lot of people, it's like their tendency is to want to push all of those metabolic systems there. And it's like, okay, like a lot of these, their adaptations are really, really fast. And if your goal is to come into a show with a ton of muscle, you don't necessarily want to do those things for like 16 weeks straight. So an overall lack of intelligent periodization, I think, is a big limiting factor. And part of that is education based, but part of it is also psychological based, especially when you look at, somebody that's gotten results with a particular program or a particular methodology. One of my experiences working with competitors is half the time the programming battle was also like a mental game of like, do they think this is going to work? How, because they get anxiety if they've had success in the past and now you're doing something different than they did before. And I think that resistance to change really slows people's ability to like kind of progress and adapt and use different methodologies. You often have to wait until somebody completely shits the bed and they like totally miss the mark to get on stage, and then maybe they'll be open to some change, right? But sometimes not. Sometimes they just go back and do the same thing, but even more restrictive, and that never turns out well, right? One of the most heartbreaking things being in the physique industry for so long was noticing, especially at the natural level, is that, and this was largely amongst female competitors, because I just think they have the female body just has a harder time bouncing back from the stress of competition, is that girls would win their pro card, but they would never, like on the pro stage, they would never bring the same look as when they were actually competing as an amateur. And so you would look at the show, the amateurs would be on stage, they would be competing, girls win a pro card, then the pros come on later, and you're like, wait a second, the top 3 amateurs would beat all of the pros, and you could just see the wear and tear on their physique. And it's like, okay, you guys have just like, you've got success with one thing, and then instead of even being open to the possibility that we could do this better or more sustainable, you just repeated it again and again and again with slightly worse outcomes over and over and over again, right? And no amount of tan can change that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like in the world. So I work primarily with rugby athletes here in Switzerland, and the kind of physical preparation side of things. But for for the sport itself, and what that reminds me of would be kind of an approach where half the year you do endurance training only, kind of the long, slow distance stuff, and then half the year you only do short sprints, and then you never meet in the middle. So you essentially, like you said, kind of almost pushing opposite adaptations for half the year, and then you're trying to go all the way to the end of the spectrum on the other side to compensate or over come back to where you want to be. Is that kind of how it is?
Yeah, and this applies to everything. I said it kind of at the beginning with my education too, that if you don't maintain competency either at an educational level, a physiological level, or whatever, and you just continue doing one thing, eventually, no matter how good you are at that one thing, something else is the limiting factor of you making progress. And sometimes the lack of those things actually forces you to regress, despite you wanting to do that. Like you take any skill-based sport and you take that person away from the other 90% of the sport, and you have them focus on just that one skill. Like you take a basketball player and you have them do nothing but shoot free throws or whatever. Like you're just going to be really, really, really good at that. If they did that for a whole year and then you threw them on the court, they would be a terrible basketball player, right? Their coordination would be off, their dribbling, their passing, like their reaction time. Sure, they might be really good at shooting free throws, but they might not score a single point during the game because they never even get to the point where they get to use or express that skill. And so the same thing happens on a physiological perspective. Like if you don't bring up your energy systems, guess what fuels protein synthesis? Guess what, is the thing that drives your recovery to allow you to switch back into parasympathetic mode? The ability to efficiently, mobilize, use, and distribute energy. Like, so if you don't ever do those things, well, guess what? It doesn't matter how many times you go in and improve your 1RM or try to, right? Your fitness is still terrible, and it's going to catch up with you.
Do you think there's an element, as a psychological element, in terms of the personalities that you might find like are successful competitively at a high level in terms of drive and in terms of just needing to do one thing really, really well instead of and having maybe a hard time balancing out the approach and maybe being a little bit more subtle with some elements of training, and instead, like you said, just going super hard in one direction for a time of the year and then super hard the other way, because that's like the only thing they know how to do it. There might be a caricature, but I was wondering if there might be that aspect to it.
Yeah, so I think good athletes have a balance of being goal orientated, but also like just enjoying like the we'll say the novelty of new challenges.
Hmm.
So especially like working with competitors, powerlifters, etc., you would have those people that were so focused on that metric that if they had to take a week or two of not tracking or progressing that just didn't work well with them, because they were so hyper focused on the goal. They couldn't take a period of time where they weren't directly working on that, even though you could try and explain to them, well, we're working on that indirectly. Like you would have to logic the crap out of those people, and then maybe you would win the argument, but they would still have anxiety about it because
Right.
they would be agreeable with you, but they wouldn't be agreeable with themselves, and so they would still be mentally resistant to periodizing out of this thing and working on something else. So I think the people that they understand have to be pursuing this goal, but they also enjoy the path and having some novelty and mixing things up and making improvements in other aspects. So if it's like, hey, if we put you on something else, you appreciate the progress through that as well, even though it may not be something that you see a direct linear correlation to your goal. They just enjoy making themselves better. Those people have longer, more sustainable careers. The people that are hyper goal focused tend to be the ones where maybe they may achieve early success, but they burn out. The people that are able to have that balance, they will have a successful long-term career. And then the people that aren't goal focused, they just never reach a very high level, but they might have more fun the whole time, right? But they're just they just may never reach their true potential in that one thing. But it may not be important to them either at that point in time. So you work with so many different personalities in here, and I think the thing that you have to do as a coach is you have to figure out how to leverage that, but also you need to leverage it to get them to make the acute decision, but you also need to help them grow as an athlete so that they have a sustainable career.
So in that vein, for coaches that are listening and who work with athletes who are maybe very stuck in their ways, and I've done it that way and it's always worked, so I'm going to stick to that. What are some of the techniques or the approaches that you've had success with when it comes to bringing something new to the table and actually getting some buy-in from the athlete?
So the thing that athletes love making results, right? That's a big thing. And so what you have to do is you have to change the measuring stick that you're using so that it fits the new goal. So part of that conversation starts with, hey, right now we're doing this, but you can create the story or the logic for why you're either going to run into a plateau or why this other thing will allow you to improve at accelerated rate. But then when you go do that, you have to be able to provide a tangible marker that it's working, because it's not going to be the same as the measuring stick they've continued to use, right? So like if you take somebody and they've been focusing on a physique outcome or whatever, and you want to put them in a strength block, okay, guess what? Now the measurement for success is pounds on the bar, but we may not have cared about that at all when we were going for like just hypertrophy or fat loss. It was more about pushing to failure and volume or whatever it may have been. So you have to make sure that you change the metrics that you're measuring and you make those the important goal and get them get the athlete to focus on that. Because if you a good athlete, if you give them a target, they're going to go for it. You can keep changing the target, but you just have to be clear what the target is, right? And then if you do a good job and they actually get results, buy-in comes really fast.
Another thing I wanted to touch on with you was the whole machines versus free weights debate, because I guess it should have been, should have been dead a long time ago, but it's still around. So can you kind of give your 2 cents on that topic? And when people say, oh, one is better than the other, what's your response?
Well, I mean, I think anytime that you kind of straw man like all machines or all free weights, what you're doing is you're just kind of showing that you're ignorant of being able to figure out what's the best tool for the job. right? And because there's pros and cons to each is a general thing. Like, okay, people say, well, free weights, you have to stabilize them more, and machines, you have a fixed path, but what if that fixed path is like right in line with your path, and then stability is no longer the limitation? Well, then that's a good thing, right? Not a bad thing. If your goal is like maximal output. So I think the big thing is understanding when to use the right thing, right? And because there's better and not so good free weight exercises and machines. So, for instance, if we look at categorically of like free weights, because we're just limited to gravity as our thing is the thing that we're overcoming. There tends to be patterns where a lot of exercises are doing very similar to the same thing. And so back training is a big one. So whether you're doing a barbell row, a dumbbell row, a cable pull down, all of those exercises have essentially a ascending resistance profile. Like they're getting harder as you're getting to the short position. Like none of those exercises are ever challenging where you're stretching your lats or your upper back. They're always easy there. So it's like you're never training that portion of the muscle's length, right? No matter how many free weight exercises that you do, but a good machine might give you the opportunity to be able to add a stimulus that you just can't otherwise, achieve. So figuring out how to get those two things to complement each other is probably the best solution, right? Especially, we all train at different gyms, and that's one of the things that we deal with coaches is like, okay, you work with 20 clients, you can't just sit down and pick your favorite exercises for all of those clients. Like you have to choose based off of what they have available. You have to do the best out of the options that they have. And if you don't understand that thought process of how to pick the right tool for the right job, you're going to have even harder time when you don't have all of the tools. You just you got all right, like 3 of the drawers in this toolbox are empty and I still have to somehow get the job done. You have to have a more creative thought process. You have to understand these more. So it's like that same example, somebody had no machines and they're training back. It's like, well, how can I make that hard? Well, maybe I can have them do a heavy partial at the bottom, so they could do, say they can full row 40 pounds, right? But I may have them do 10 reps with that, set that down, and then grab a 65 or an 80, something that they can only do the lengthened portions. So it's like, hey, now we can challenge that range of motion. I came up with the strategy because we didn't have anything else, right? Or you get really creative. Like we had this whole coronavirus thing and we were training in the garage for a while. We made a pendulum squat out of a dip belt and a TRX, right? So just depends on what you're willing to put into it. But when you understand the principles and the concepts of how to okay, stop looking at this as a category of exercise and just look at what does this actually do? What does it challenge? How does it move? How can I use that? Is it beneficial towards my goal? Is there a way for me to adjust my body position or whatever to make it better or to change its purpose to, suit a different goal? Then man, your programming options are unlimited and it gets more fun. It gets more interesting.
Yeah, so maybe building onto that, something that you've built recently is what you call the N1 Lab. So can you talk about what that is and why you created it?
So I mean, the real reason I created it was just to argue with people on the internet.
It's a great reason.
Yeah, no. So with a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, the way that I look at where we're at is just that we have pushed so far beyond the applied research, and we're looking at things through a totally different lens. Like if you look at the way we program, and then you look at a study on volume, you'd be like, well, that doesn't even apply to what we're doing because of how specific we're being with these stimulus and whatnot. And so it's like, man, to be able to test this stuff, we're going to have to do it ourselves, right? Or it's going to happen long after I'm dead. So those are kind of like the two options. So what we did is we built a lab where we could get acute data. So it's EMG, it's Moxy or NIRS, which is looking at muscle oxygen hemoglobin. We have a variety of force sensors, the ability to assess to measure motion, velocity, etc. we have kind of a neuromuscular test that we do. It's a manual thing that we've been refining for several years. We throw that on top of biomechanical modeling, and then the system that we have, it's a Neuraxon is the company, but what the thing that's unique is I'm able to sync all of this stuff with video so that I can look at like this portion of the rep, right, and see everything that's going on. And so I'm able to get a lot of acute data layering these technologies, which all have their own limitations, but with us kind of looking at things through a little bit more nuanced lens and then layering the technology on top of each other, we're working on developing protocols where it's like, okay, previously the confidence in maybe using EMG for this particular test is pretty low, but now when we layer this stuff on here and we do a much more specific type protocol, and I mean, we're doing this stuff exclusively on not just people that are trained, but people that are very proficient at exercise, right? Because somebody could be like, yeah, I've lifted weights for X amount of years, and then you look at them and be like, ew, right? Like, congratulations, your joints are freaking resilient, or whatever it may be. So I think what we're doing, we might be the only people that can do it right now. But we're able to get like data on the day with this setup, which is so cool. Like, so I mean, this week we have like 5 things that we're gonna go and test, and basically every day we're gonna come back and be like, okay, cool. We either proved or disproved, or we figured out a weakness and thing. A huge headache, of this whole system, like pioneering this, is we're using all these technologies together, and nobody's tried to do that, and the technical hurdles have been huge. For instance, we worked out that we can't have all of the devices plugged into certain USBs because the power cycle of the computer doesn't keep up with the sync of one of the sensors. So basically, it seems that more cords is like something that progresses every week. We have a progressive overload of the amount of cords and things and wires and stuff that we're needing just to drive the hardware. So you guys will probably hear the story like, yeah, Kassem was doing a thing or whatever, but then he accidentally strangled himself in 87 feet of USB-C cord or something like that. But the it's exciting, and it's actually for our team here, we've been kind of fighting this uphill battle of trying to explain some of the things that we do in a low barrier of entry fashion. And that's kind of like that joke of like arguing with people on the internet. For instance, I've been on podcasts or whatever, you go to debate somebody on biomechanics or something, or physiology or whatever, and the ability to do that depends on you kind of being kind of like having the same foundational of understanding or whatever. But if you're coming from a completely different perspective than somebody else, you have to somehow find where is that point that we have common enough ground. And sometimes that takes more time than actually, the debate itself. So it's like, well, if we can just do some of these studies and technologies that people have a somewhat understanding, and then just show that, I don't have to teach them all the physics of the joint mechanics and all the biochemistry and all the hemodynamics and all of that stuff to be able to explain the rationale. I can just look at the chart. You see the little pretty line? Yeah. So better, worse, it just, that's the goal, is to, one, validate what we're doing, but also lower the barrier of entry to being able to see these concepts working.
What are some of the things that you've been able to measure or see that you couldn't see without those tools before, since you started it?
We've done a lot of things already. So we've been looking at the effect of different resistance profiles, different muscle lengths, protocols. A lot of what we're doing also is just actually going through the isolated exercises that we teach. So like we'll teach a pull down that's for iliac lats, so just the lower division of the lat, and people will be like, well, you can, like, well, look, we can do it, right? We can show that, like, if we do it this way, that portion of the lat works more over the set than the other portions of the lat. All the way to the point that, like, we've been able to show that I can isolate the lateral or long head of my bicep over the short head of my bicep by just using different setups. And some of that's cool. How applicable is that to training? Like, are you going to have a long head bicep day and a short head bicep day? Probably not. But, you know, when we're looking at things like shoulder health and people developing physiques and just understanding like periodization over a year, it may be like, well, okay, now I have a new tool to be able to, you know, throw in some variations of elbow flexion training over the course of the year to get more complete development, maintain more joint health and stuff like that. But I'm not necessarily going to grow a hematoma outside of like the lateral bicep area because I've just been doing a lot of long head bicep work. But understanding the context in which this stuff can be very beneficial and knowing, okay, it is actually possible. And it's kind of cool because some of the stuff is things you would have heard like in the 80s or 90s that has just been dismissed as like bro science. And I'm like, well, you know, these guys, they were so focused on what they were doing. A lot of the things that they made claims of that were debunked by bad science are actually being affirmed by better science, right? And you see that a lot in the industry. So we've been able to show that we can really isolate tissues a lot better than what people think. Now, the thing is that most of what you see in the gym is not very isolated training, which is probably a big reason why people think you can't do that, because they're not really getting to a lot of the extreme positions that we are with the specificity, because it's very specificity sensitive, which is why if you don't understand biomechanics well, like these tool sets are just not going to be available to you. You have to know how to set somebody up for this. Other things that we've done, especially on the hemodynamic side, is when we've been able to show that like different resistance profiles allow for different amounts of blood flow versus occlusion going in. So one of the things that we've pushed is that if you choose an exercise that's more challenging in the short position, it tends to be better for metabolic stimulus and doesn't really result in some of like, you know, as much soreness and stuff like that. And so when we were able to look at that with the Moxy and actually look at blood flow and occlusion, we're actually to see that when you do that, you're able to keep pushing blood into that tissue more, which would mean, okay, I'm actually able to extend the biochemical work of this exercise a little bit more than I am these other positions where something loaded in the lengthened position seems to be the most challenging to continue to get blood into that muscle. And probably because as it's stretched and also under load, that's just so much more pressure that it's a lot harder to push blood into that tissue. So it tends to occlude more. And that's a huge one for us, because if you're in the circle of this industry that like gets nerdy into the physics and focuses on resistance profiles and whatnot, there's a certain niche that thinks that like there's only one resistance profile, like you match the strength profile and then you only train that thing. And I can tell you that definitely is not optimal. I've been through that process from the educational side, from the practical side, et cetera, and it does not play out well. It doesn't work out theoretically either. So, for instance, if I've actually picked something that matched what I could do, it's if I did a 1RM, that would maybe be a good idea because you would challenge it the whole way. But if you're doing 10 reps, that means over the course of those 10 reps, you're under shooting like 9 out of those 10 reps in terms of your peak. You're not creating peak tension in any of those positions. And then there's the aspect that as soon as you create a little bit of fatigue, your strength profile changes. So if you do 10 reps, it's different every rep, right? So it's like, well, how do you do that? So the only way to truly match the resistance to the strength profile every rep would be something like an isokinetic machine. Which, you know, I mean, if you want to spend 25 grand on a bicep curl and then a leg extension or whatever, I mean, go ahead, if you got that FU money. But from a practical sense, it's like, okay, so instead of, you know, looking like, you know, a BDSM ad, you know, with all these things attached to you trying to get this perfect resistance profile, if you just understood how to take advantage and when to use a lot of the exercises that are just readily available or maybe more easily manipulated, you get a better training effect, and there's a lot less mental masturbation involved. So having this and being able to do that, I think is going to be huge, because I know a lot of people that are very we'll say, they're very intellectual, like based, like they really like thinking about that stuff, but they're essentially doing themselves more harm than good. And it's the same thing for their clients. So being able to have some evidence to kind of debunk that, I think is going to be really good to kind of help those people not get in their own way in terms of delivering a better client experience and better results.
Now that makes a lot of sense. For those who don't have a hard time maybe picturing it, can you give an example of two exercises that might train the same muscle but with different different tensions at different lengths, and how that affects, like you said, blood flow?
Mm-hmm. So biceps are usually a really easy example for
Mm.
people. Elbow is a pretty simple joint, right? It flexes. So one example we always give is like if you're doing a standing, dumbbell curl, okay? When you have your arm like parallel to the floor, that's when the weight is essentially furthest away from your elbow being the pivot joint. So that would be where there's the most resistance for you to overcome. And so what you typically see when people do exercises, like if they're, especially if they're doing all free weights, well, maybe they'll do dumbbell curls, like standing, then maybe they'll do them incline. Maybe they'll do like, prone incline, or they'll do a preacher curl. All of those exercises, like a preacher curl, your arm's slightly out in front of you, right? So now when your arm is parallel to the floor, your elbow's a little bit more extended. So it's loading it in a little bit more length, but it's still kind of in the middle. It's just not directly in the middle. In an incline curl, your shoulder is extended, like your arms are kind of hanging behind you a little bit. But as you lift up, your elbow's still at 90 degrees, but the bicep itself is stretched a little bit more. So those are small differences, and we've kind of changed the muscle length, but we're still kind of challenging the middle. But if you were to say take some pulleys, right, and like set them low and then walk out in front, so the pulleys were actually pulling a little bit behind you. Now that is really challenging the elbow when it's extended. And as you curl up, where the cable is almost like touching your arm, it gets significantly lighter. So that's a big difference, right? Rather than like, okay, we can do like these 18, bicep curls out of, Arnold's Encyclopedia or whatever. But how big of a change are those? Are they actually a big enough change that you would include them in the same program? Or are these like maybe things that you would just use over, different mesos or whatever? You have to look at, man, what creates like a big change. So doing a bicep curl with cables pulling behind you versus a dumbbell, which is just always going to be harder somewhere close to the middle range, unless you like lay on your back or something. Don't do that; it's a crappy exercise. But someone will try it. That's a big change in resistance profile, right? And you can do that with different exercises. You can do it with accommodating resistance, like bands, like all sorts of things, right? So bands are a thing that people, I think, use, and I think there's a certain portion of the population that just thinks that if you put a band on something, it just makes it better, more hardcore, like whatever. But understand that bands always influence the resistance in the same direction. It's harder where the band is being stretched more, or if it's reverse banded, it's still the same direction. So like for a hack squat, if you band it from the bottom up to the horns, the band is pulling you down harder as you stretch it up. If you band it from the top down to the horns, it's taking more weight off of the bottom. So the change is in the same direction, but there's different components to that, right? Having a band that you have to push into is really good if you're trying to accelerate into it. Having a band that's kind of taking resistance off at the bottom is good if you're trying to use more of a controlled, like focusing on mechanical tension motion, because you're able to just kind of make that point where normally, so like if a squat, hack squat, any of those exercises where the hardest part is in where the muscle is stretched and the joint is at its most disadvantageous position, basically you have to stop the exercise when you fail at that one point. Mm-hmm. Meaning that you might have work done in the other like 75% range of the motion. So using something like a reverse band can be a great way of increasing mechanical tension by changing task failure from being the weakest point to maybe a little bit more stronger point. So it's like I can get a higher volume of mechanical tension by making it so that I'm not just limited to the weakest link in the chain. And so you have so many different reasons and ways to be able to use this stuff. Sorry, I'm kind of ranting on there, but I think that those two things kind of go
That
hand
makes
in
sense.
hand, because with resistance profiles, people that don't understand the biomechanics, the easiest thing is just like bands, right? That
Right.
changes things.
Right. So think about, so as a takeaway, think about where at which length the muscle is most challenged in that range of motion. And then as a general kind of advice, would you say that you want to train you want to challenge the muscle maximally at different lengths throughout, whether it's a week, whether it's a month, whether it's throughout the year?
So, in terms of challenging a muscle for function, it's more important that we take it through its full range of motion
Mm-hmm.
than challenge it at
Right.
all of the different aspects. But from a progression, especially in like hypertrophy,
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be times where you want to put a higher volume of work in certain resistance profiles. So for instance, the example I gave you is like, all right, if we challenge the short position of either a resistance profile or muscle length, those are really good if we're trying to increase the metabolic, taxation of the exercise. So we're focusing more on that type of stimulus. But if your goal is high volume mechanical tension, you did a bunch of that, you would then be too like metabolically exhausted to get a lot of other high tension based work in.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to say that like you don't always have to have them all. But it's definitely like, especially, I mean, if we're looking at a large time scale, like, over a year, you definitely want to hit them all. I would say, at least in some bit, like if over the course of say like 2 or 3 months, you probably want to hit all of them in there. But it could be a very small amount of volume if it's not the thing that correlates to your stimulus the most, right? Again, it's about maintaining that foundational basis. So the same thing applies to
Mm-hmm.
our structural integrity, our ability to stabilize the joint throughout its entire range of motion. If you never load a joint at one part of its range of motion, what happens when all of a sudden you break technique, you lose form, or you do a new exercise or something, where all of a sudden you get there in a bad spot, right? That's going to make you more likely to get injured if you have no competency and no strength in those positions. So it's kind of like you need to maintain a proficiency, but your volume should be based off of the resistance profiles that most attribute towards your goal. And this is obviously a thing that we spend, hours and hours and hours and hours covering, right? Um, but understand that training muscles at different lengths and at different resistance profiles not only having like different physiological goals, they'll have different limitations in terms of what you can do,
Mm-hmm.
because some of them will come with more soreness, more neuroinflammation. So it will actually affect either the volume you can do per session or how frequently that you can do those activities. So depending on, maybe it's like you're trying to do a stimulus, but you also want to structure it throughout the week this way, you may need to make decisions that allow that to happen. Because if you're doing something Monday and you're trying to repeat the same muscle groups on Thursday, but you're still like blitzingly sore because you trained something in a super stretched position for a high amount of volume, well, then it doesn't matter. Like okay, like, yeah, that's for the stimulus, but guess what? We're not hitting it on Thursday, or the performance is just going to be so bad that you would have been better off choosing something better, right? That stupid N of one thing always getting in the way of just, making pretty paper programs.
Now, I guess it makes sense. It always goes back to the overall context, and then what are you applying it for? When are you applying it? Who are you as a person? And all the other factors that come into play.
Mm-hmm.
One of the tools you mentioned, the Moxy, is something that I'm really interested in. When did you first get or become aware of the Moxy as a tool, as NIRS technology as such? And then what did it change in the way that you see things or do things?
So being aware of NIRS probably, uh, it's probably been several years back, because it's been one of the things that they've looked at, and some of the studies comparing range of motion and things like that. They've looked at, muscle oxygen as well as like, since BFR has been the hot topic in the research. It's also a tool that they use in some of that research. But in terms of the Moxy itself and having a consumer friendly version, I actually was unaware of that until I was on a podcast with Ben House. We were kind of talking about some of the things that we do from the metabolic training perspective. And he's like, I think you could test these things with mirrors. And Evan was actually the next podcast after mine,
Right.
and so that's kind of how I ended up getting involved with the Moxy stuff, was through Ben, then Evan, and then that took me there. And I mean Evan's been the I think the first person that I know of that's really been thinking about this, using that tool in this application. And now basically what we've done is we've been able to just pile a mound of that data in there, right? And it's interesting because I mean the Moxy was essentially, it's just designed to go on the quad, and here we are, we're putting it on everything in the body. We're doing middle delts and things like that. And so I mean I have at least like 6 different spandex suits for all of my staff now. With we have just like tons of stuff. It looks like we're designing like a spandex Iron Man suit or something, because we got cut out holes with duct tape and stuff all over, trying to find better ways to hold sensors in place and get options and stuff like that. But it's cool. But man, sometimes being first sucks. Trying to figure this stuff out, right? Like for instance, we're having trouble right now getting good glute data, and I'm very curious why that is, and I'm almost wondering if there's like a light reflection thing on, like, because it's a concave bone, that there's some sort of interference or something there. I mean, we'll see, right? Because it seems to be like when we're trying to do like glute med or something, is that the data just looks really, really weird.
Interesting. What software are you using? Are you getting data in real time, or are you doing the analysis after the fact?
We're doing both.
What are you using for real time kind of data?
So we have the Periodization that we're using for real time, as well as the VO2 Master app, which basically, I mean, the VO2 Master app I've basically been using for when we're doing like a HIIT protocol or something like that for the real time data. Saves me from having to drag the whole lab there. I can just connect it to a phone, and I don't need to see the information as precise. Whereas the Periodization, like if we're doing resistance training, like I need to be able to see that short window really well. Because a lot of times we spend a little bit of time just trying to standardize what, like, the sensor placement and the exercise and whatnot beforehand. Because sometimes we'll start out, we'll have multiple sensors on a limb, and then we'll be like, all right, now do this, and then you do a leg curl or whatever, and 2 of the sensors run into each other, and one drops signal, and so like, okay, how can we move these? Can we only do 2? Can we do 2 on one leg and 1 on the other, and then know the limitation to that data, but then we can flip it around? And so there's a whole process right now of just like trying to figure out the best protocols, which is essentially what we're trying to do. So we need that real time for that, and then afterwards we're exporting from there the CSV right out of the Periodization, but sometimes we pull the raw data off on the Moxy. So it just depends. I mean, pulling the raw data off the Moxy gives you this huge thing that you have to like sort through, which is a pain in the ass. So the majority of the time, unless I need the higher frequency data, then we use the CSVs right out of Periodization, because it's like, all right, this was set whatever, and these are the conditions, versus going through, well, here's a 2-hour period. Good luck finding all of the things that you need in there.
Yeah, exactly. I guess you can also change the refresh rate or the data collection rate on the Moxy, so that you have a more precise interval time between the data points, right?
Yeah. So when we pull the data directly off the Moxy, it's when we want that. So it does the half-second reading, right? So you get 2 readings a second. Whereas with the Periodization, the fastest, or it only gives you 1 per second. Right. 1 reading per second on there, even if you have the Moxy sensor set to do the every half second. So right? And we're playing around there. Well, I haven't tried the Perf Pro, and then I think this week we're going to try and figure out how the Golden Cheetah thing works for a little bit better data analysis. You know, the worst part about this is that I had to get buy a Windows laptop, and it just hurts my soul, and it's so unintuitive, and that's been one of the biggest frustrations. I mean, you know, we got on this call. I was just telling you I had this trouble connected with my laptop. It's a few years old, my MacBook.
Yeah.
This thing has no problems other than this headphone connection with Zoom. But that brand new, like it's a like $3,500 gaming laptop or whatever, dude. It's been a problem since day one. Like it, you know, I don't know how people live like that.
I hear you. Maybe we need to summon the Moxy gods to drop us some kind of OS, you know, Mac OS software so they can work with something.
Yeah. Well, actually, what we're working on right now is nurturing the relationship between Moxy and Naraxon, so that the Moxy will eventually be right in the Naraxon system. So that'll just eliminate all of that. I mean, it's still maybe beyond there, but it's like, okay, only one Windows application to have to worry about. Like that's much better than, you know, 3 or 4.
Not sure.
But also, then the data will be it'll be synced. There won't be like exporting and doing all this stuff. It'll just be right there. Beautiful. That's the goal. If you guys are listening to this, work faster.
Yeah, I think I guess the use of the Moxy itself has become very, very user friendly over the years compared to what it was before. But like you said, the data treatment side of things is still not up to snuff, I would say. There's still there's a big margin for improvement there.
Especially like as simple as what it seems the data is, right?
Yes.
Like if you just export it into a spreadsheet, I'm like, how hard is it to design good software that just takes time and number? Like, you know, it's like,
yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I'm not a software engineer, but it does not seem that like this should be one of the biggest obstacles in our, you know, technological development, right?
No, I agree. If you could take a spreadsheet and you know, throw up even a graph, if you do it, you know, I've done it by hand on Google Sheets, where you just export as a graph and put 2 different axes on the Y, and then you've got your nice, pretty graph. You know, how hard is that to do? You know, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, moving on to some audience questions for you here. I've got Stefan asking, up to what % can nutrition and/or improved biokinetics have an impact on performance, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, how much depends. So when I look at the small details, and you'll see this in the research as well, is that when you put one nuance, you know, you layer one nuance thing, sometimes it may have a null effect. But what seems to happen is that when you layer one on top of another, they have an exponential effect. So it's like, okay, if your nutrition is optimized in a way that it works really well with a very well-designed training system, and that happens to be very, you know, very well coordinated to what your body happens to need at the time. Like, okay, the little bit of nuances that you spent, you know, making that nutrition a little bit better, that training a little bit better for you at that point, all of a sudden now it has a big effect, right? But if you don't layer those things on top of each other, you may think like, well, you know, I tried to make this thing a little bit better, but it didn't have that much of an effect. But, you know, you could be designing the nutrition program that maybe works well for you right now, but your training program doesn't gel with that. So you may not see, you like, okay, then you're really not going to see any of those benefits, because one thing is there's still a limiting factor that's like preventing you from being able to express the benefits of that improved nutrition. So an advanced athlete, especially if you take in the context of time, I would say you can probably have 20 to 30% better results over the course of a year, not accounting for if somebody has a health or injury-based issue or whatever, right? So assuming that they did things suboptimally but just survived it well, I would say when you layer those nuances on there, you can get like 20, 30% better results over the course of the year. You take any of those nuances and you put them out of context, that number may become 2%. Right?
Yeah, so it has to be, it's almost like if you were thinking about, just the training piece, if somebody was doing, I'm doing a small off over there, and then I'm doing I don't know, Jack Daniel's running program over there, and then it's not holistic. I mean, you're not looking at the big picture, you're just doing something here, doing something there. But if you integrate them together in a way that makes sense, you'll probably get much better results on all fronts, and then layer in
Yeah.
nutrition into that, and it
Yeah.
compounds, right?
Yeah. Think of it like, I think sometimes if you put this like, everybody drives a car. If you put the absolute best tires in the world on your car, they're like brand new technology, super, super cool. But the limiting factor for your car was the transmission or the engine or whatever. Like how much like you're going to get barely any improvement
Mm-hmm.
out of those tires. But what if you put on tires that were just a little bit better, but you also tuned the engine and the transmission at the same time, and they were all working together? You would outperform the car with the magic tires, like instantly. And that's kind of how you have to look at this, is like, man, if I can just make it so that I'm always kind of eliminating the weakest link in the chain,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then bringing everything up, those things all layer on top of each other and you get this exponential benefit. But if I just have this one thing that make it so good, but it's not the limiting factor, it doesn't matter.
That makes sense. Next question by Darko. He asks, what is the best training periodization for muscle gain?
So, I mean, there's not a black and white answer to that,
Mm.
but I always like to humor these questions with at least some principal takeaways. And so what I would say is that, one of the things that we often do is that we'll have a block where we're focusing on mechanical tension, but then we will step out of that and then we will focus more on the conditioning work. So we will bring up some systemic and local conditioning,
Mm-hmm.
and then jump back in, so that doesn't become the limiting factor in our hypertrophy training, right? Because you need to be locally conditioned to be able to tolerate volume, and to be able to like fuel those recovery pathways. You need to be systemically conditioned to be able to optimize your recovery outside of the gym, because the better you are systemically conditioned, the better that you regulate energy systemically through the liver, your cortisol levels, all of those things become more well regulated, and you can go from being, sympathetic dominant to parasympathetic dominant easier. And as you're doing things throughout the day, you don't jump into sympathetic dominance as easy. So if you're really well conditioned and you go up a flight of stairs, you might stay parasympathetic dominant. You look at somebody that's very poor condition, they go up a set of stairs and they're in like fight or flight mode, right? Like, I mean, I'm in Colorado. I know this very, very well, right? Like it doesn't take a lot of activity when you have lower oxygen levels to all of a sudden like push your state. So the better conditioned you are, the more your body can be in a state of recovery, which hypertrophy is over recovery. And people don't realize that. Like they want to train hard. I like to train hard too. But focusing on recovery usually is a lot less sexy. But in reality, hypertrophy is a game of over recovering, not over training.
Now that makes sense. So that might be another argument for keeping at least a thread of it year round for people, even, if you train in the physique world or chase hypertrophy, because it is going to, help you along the way, even though it's not, it's like a kind of a backdoor way of helping you towards your goal. It's not the main driver of adaptation that's going to get you more muscle, but it is definitely important on the big picture side of things.
Yeah, you'll see that with the whole debate of like, do metabolites cause hypertrophy? And I'm all like, well, not like you wouldn't use that as your main driver for hypertrophy, but metabolite training does allow you to get more hypertrophy by addressing other things.
Right.
Right.
Next question, Damian asks, is it a bad idea to train with DOMs?
Well, bad idea. It's definitely not optimal, right? So when we look at DOMs, from our research, DOMS has more to do with inflammation around the nervous system than it does in terms of magnitude, right? So you can get DOMS from mechanical trauma, but with what we've done, and we've actually just finished up an internal study on this where we compared training at different resistance profiles versus different muscle length, and training in the lengthened position was way more significant DOMs than any resistance profile in a less lengthened position. So a lengthened position, regardless of resistance profile, like when we get to that full stretch, there's actually a good paper that came out, I believe, in like Nature, ironically, not like JAP or whatever, but like addressing how there's this compression and like how, because you have a fixed amount of space, we kept like in that stretch position of the muscle, we push those metabolites around, and that's what creates kind of like that neuroinflammation in those stretch positions. And if the nervous system is inflamed, that's going to affect your ability to recruit. It's going to affect your coordination. So you're going to get less performance, probably higher risk of injury. Maybe not if you're just not able to do the loads or whatever, but definitely it's not optimal, especially in the sense of like hypertrophy. Now you could make the case that they're like, if you're focusing on pure body fat loss or whatever, and you're trying to maintain frequency, that maybe training through a little bit of DOMs isn't terrible. But what I would say is if that's the case that you're ending up with, there's probably something that you can do from an exercise selection or volume or whatever to, or just manipulating your program so that that doesn't end up being the case. So the question is not how bad is it, it's why would you if you have the ability to not?
Yeah, that makes sense. Cass, I've got a couple closing questions for you. First one is, what are you currently fascinated about, and what will you be investigating in the coming weeks or months?
So after we kind of get through our exercise library of establishing our ability to bias these tissues, the next thing that's going to be really fun is then starting to look at supersetting, like pre and post exhaust has always been one of those things where, you know, there's a lot of different debates, and we have our own perspective on that, is actually looking at the different types of, like, you know, training archetypes, if you will, and seeing how that affects the ability. What I'm really trying to figure out right now, especially with the NIRS, is trying to get what is the best tangible thing that we can have that is a predictor of how many effective reps or how much like actual volume of stimulus are we getting. So looking at that oxygen desaturation, and is it how deep it goes, how long it goes, like is there a threshold, like a area under the curve thing that we can kind of calculate. And then once we have that, then we can actually look at these protocols and be like, how efficient are we at actually getting volume of the mechanical tension that we associate with hypertrophy stimulus? And then we can say, okay, this is cool. And then that could then lead to better long-term studies, right? Because it's like, okay, we can actually now give a protocol where it's like acutely, this looks like it's playing out this way, right? Now, big university that wants to babysit people for, 16 weeks, you come in and you're in the longitudinal study, I'll move on to something else. But that's one of the big goals of what we're doing with this is if we can create precedent, then maybe some of these other labs that, have an army of grad students can do the long studies on this and then actually look at like hypertrophy outcomes or things like that over time.
Second question for you. What are you hoping to see more of in the physique world in the coming months or years?
Well, that's big. I'm really looking forward to seeing what Flex Lewis looks like at not 212. Like, does that count? So he's, I mean, in the physique world, one of the things that fascinates me the most is just the appreciation for the freaks, and I say freaks is in a good way.
Yeah.
Because being a regular human myself, if anything, on the the less fortunate side in terms of the physique genes, you look just the marvel of being able to look at how what people can do with some bodies, right? And the limitations of this, and not getting depressed that like, oh, but like I can't do that. But just being able to marvel of like what is possible, that's really cool. And on the scientific side, I mean, to be honest, the thing that excites me the most is what we're doing, right? I mean, I think some of the stuff that Bill Campbell's doing out of the physique lab in Florida, is cool. But outside of that, like none of the other research really interests me. It's all like most of it is like looking at stuff that either it seems like, well, it's not really relevant because of the way they're doing it, or they're testing something that's like a duh, right? Like I love all the studies that come out and be like, yeah, people have been doing that for like years. It's made sense or whatever and whatnot. And now we just got to like, yeah, keep doing it. And I'm like, all right. I mean, it's nice to have, but it's not that exciting. It's
Right.
like it's not changing the industry. I'm hoping the stuff that we're doing actually like brings some new thought and some new application to the industry.
So for those who want to follow that that journey alongside what you do, where can they find out more about you and what you do with N1?
So you can visit any of our sites. So we have n1.training, which is our membership site. It's got our exercise library and articles, videos. If you actually want to take our courses, you can visit n1.education. Our Instagram accounts are the exact same thing. If you want to follow me, where you're going to get more rants and things like that than the other stuff, you can follow me. It's Coach_Kassem, mainly on Instagram. If you're very interested in the stuff that we're doing from the labs, what we're going to try and do is start doing like a monthly like just overview of like, here's what we tested, here's what we found, like an unofficial kind of what's going on, but we're not quite there in terms of like the volume, because I mean, people don't want to listen to all of the follies that we've had in terms of just trying to figure out like how to do this. It's like, well, today Kassem almost threw the laptop again because this arrow, yeah, that's the one benefit about how expensive this stuff is it's kept me from breaking it so far. That's if it was not expensive, we would at least be on like version 4 by now, probably.
I hear
Yeah,
you.
so hopefully we will be doing that, and that'll be on our websites. It may end up being on YouTube, etc. too, right? I mean, pretty much if you just you throw us in any search engine, you'll find all of our stuff. Or if you go to any of our social profiles, we got everything else in there, right? Or if you're just in the know, it's gonna find you.
Good stuff, man. I'll make sure I link all of those in the podcast description for the audience. Thanks again for coming on today. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Awesome, Sean. Have a good day.
All right, take care.